Hello and welcome back all to the 2014 fantasy football season. Hi, I am your host for the draft lottery this afternoon and or evening, depending on which part of the country you are watching. I am Todd Kiper Berman Jr. Welcome back. We're here to do today for the draft lottery for Daniel Ingram's league, the SPE League, a league that should have been in the Wild West. If you look at this league, lots of move, lots of activity, a lot had to do with that, with the free agency and not a lack of a waiver wire. It created a lot of chaos, but a lot of trades made, a lot of new owners making a big impression in a big way. You got to be excited about what this league holds. Another Wild West year can only be expected. Now first, let's have a moment of silence for our two fallen members, Connor Slater and Tim Baker. Both guys didn't put up a very good season, but you liked having them in the league. They're nice guys, friendly guys, the both of them. And again, not exactly a moment of silence because music is playing in the background. I'd like to apologize for the moment of silence, disrespect there with the music, but I didn't want to hit the pause button. I'm on a roll. Anyways, looking back on this SPE League, we have to first look at the changes that have happened in this league. Now let me grab my sheet and recap this so I can get it right. First off, last year only 4 playoff teams made things very competitive. They're adding 2 playoff teams this year, much like the NFL. You got to be excited about that. If you're a 5th or 6th place team last year, getting a chance to get your team to the championship game, winning that big prize, that's what it's all about. Also, 5 bench players this year instead of 7. It's going to allow a lot more waiver wire action. And speaking of the waiver wire, there is no free agency this year. There will not be an open period starting at 2 a.m. on, I believe, Tuesday morning. That's not for all of us. Some of us aren't late night people. And therefore, a waiver wire, I guess, has been put into effect for the year, causing definitely some differences. The moves will probably cut down a little bit, but overall we'll probably make a little bit more of a competitive league. The trades will be a little bit lot less lopsided, you would think. Of course, we're also looking at randomized divisions this year. Divisions were set last year. This year they're randomized, creating a lot of intrigue, a lot of very competitive owners out there. You like to see that. You like this league. Again, a league that should just be called the Wild West League with how crazy it was last year. And with the league as that crazy, you would think of experienced fantasy owners, somebody who has been playing the game for years would overall take the championship. Well, you were wrong, folks. Last year, a rookie owner came in, made a ton of moves, and absolutely blew up the league, took it by storm. That's right, I'm talking about Mike Mullen. Here's a guy who makes a total of 158 transactions for the league. I believe a fantasy record. My sources at ESPN have not confirmed. My sources at CBS and Yahoo have confirmed. If he would have played in those leagues, would have been the most free agent waiver wire transactions. That allowed him to do a lot of trades. That's right, a league high 20 trades. This is a guy who set the momentum for the league. A guy you thought who would come in as a new owner and would need to be shown the ropes of fantasy, but boy were we wrong, because by the end of the season, he was showing everybody else the ropes. This guy has an absolutely stacked roster, a roster that won a championship with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, and that's right, he was only starting 6.8% of leagues. In the championship game, this guy goes out, gives the Texas A&M product a chance to win a game, a chance to win a league for him. He comes through. This is a guy that puts a lot of trust in his players, a lot of value into his players. He's honestly the boldest fantasy player this analyst, as in Todd Kiper Berman Jr., has ever seen. You got to commend this guy, an absolute phenomenal championship performance. I mean, listen to this roster. Matt Forte, Marshawn Lynch, A.J. Green, Deshaun Jackson, Jimmy Graham, Chris Johnson, who, although is tailing off, still has blazing speed, still has that 4.29 kind of speed we saw at the Combine. He also has Adam Vinatieri, probably one of the most clutch kickers of all time. If you want to win a championship, you have Adam Vinatieri on your team as the kicker. Again, a guy who ended up showing us the ropes. A guy who just names the team after himself, doesn't even put any kind of creativity into it. That's how confident he is in his name and his value and the way he plays the game. This guy wins games. I mean, listen to his bench. His bench isn't even that great. The guy knew you needed great players on your starting lineup, didn't worry about the bench too much. Again, a very active owner. And you're looking back on it, you're looking at the season, how did this Wild West thing occur? I think you have to look at Mike Mullen, and I think you have to look at one specific trade that really got the ball rolling, and that was the David Wilson trade he made with Daniel Ingram. That's right, the league's commissioner got a real infatuation with David Wilson. Mike Mullen saw this, made a multiplayer trade. At the time, some very big names were being swapped, even though those names didn't end up being on Mullen's team for the most part, and or Ingram's team. That set the momentum for the league, got the ball rolling, and again, you have to look at Mike Mullen, you have to look at him as a league champion, and you have to be scared of him this year as an owner. He's only getting better in a couple leagues now. You know he's been doing mocks. You got to be excited. Again, I can't say enough about the way he performed last year. Honestly, the boldest fantasy performance I've ever seen. And so we'll start off with his lottery ball. Mike Merwin, everybody. There it is. We're putting it into the bingo cage as we speak. Now we're moving on to the second place team, a team that had the best regular season record, 11-2. That's really kind of unheard of in fantasy. 11-2. You don't find a team consistently that good, and that's the team I'm talking about. I'm talking about Nathan Sprunk. That's right, everybody. This guy made some absolutely phenomenal late-round picks, in particular with his Broncos, his hometown team. I'm talking about No Sean Moreno. I'm talking about Julius Thomas. Both guys were consistently putting up points on a week-to-week basis. I mean, this is a guy who had 7 players that were ranked at the top 10 in their position in his starting lineup. You can't look at a guy and say, oh, he doesn't have a good team, because this guy did. He's absolutely phenomenal. He had Matthew Stafford, who you know is going to drop back. You know he's going to be throwing it 50 times. He's got the New Orleans Saints coordinator this year coming in. You know, as a Detroit Lion, they're going to be slinging it. They got Calvin Johnson, Megatron, Eric Ebron in the draft in North Carolina. Wouldn't be surprised to see Sprunk grab Matthew Stafford 4th, 5th round. That's the kind of the range he usually likes to draft a quarterback. Now, again, this is a guy that nailed some running backs. He got No Sean Moreno, Zach Stacy, both late-season bloomers. No Sean Moreno, less so, more of a consistently throughout the season, performed. But Zach Stacy, absolutely a late bloomer, a guy that got him to that championship game. You know he's got to be disappointed going 11-2, losing that championship game. But you got to look at some of his receivers, and that's where he was lacking. A guy that doesn't necessarily have the receiver knowledge of former defensive lineman and offensive lineman in flag football, defensive lineman contact football. We're talking about a guy who doesn't know much about the receiving position, I guess, when in terms of fantasy. He's got James Jones, Mike Wallace, both big names, both decent quarterbacks. Mike Wallace signed that huge contract. Of course, Miami thought Tannehill, long ball, would connect more. He didn't. That hurt Sprunk late in the season. He did score the most points in the league, though. Like I said, this is a guy who traded his top running back. He traded Adrian Peterson. He got Jamal Charles back. Ended up being a huge play. Jamal Charles ends up being the top fantasy running back. Apologies. Todd Kiper Berman would like to apologize to Jamal Charles for calling him a quarterback instead of a running back. He feels like it is. But this is a guy who gets Jamal Charles, absolutely explodes onto the scene last year, makes a big play for his team. You know, he got benched that last week. That definitely hurt him going into the championship game. Rowan, as an owner, had to be happy about that as the opposing owner. But again, Nathan Sprunk, everybody. Second place team, got to watch out for him this year. Here's his ball. NS. Moving on to the third place team, a team that really just was absolutely drafted phenomenally. A guy that made 0 trades throughout the year. That's right, I'm talking Carl Krause. Now, his name might not have been the greatest. We're talking Over the Dwayne Bowe. He's obviously referencing Wizard of the Oz, obviously talking about Over the Rainbow, a song that's usually for women, but Carl Krause goes with it, trying to do a Chief-related name. I get it, he's a KC guy, but again, he can't be a big fan of the name. You got to think that's why he ended up with the third place game and not the championship when he drafted so well. When I'm talking about drafting well, I'm talking about drafting absolute fantasy studs last year. I'm talking Drew Brees, LaShawn McCoy, Andre Johnson, who although did deal with injury issues, had some big games, had the chance and converted on helping Carl win some big fantasy games down the line. A guy who finished second place in the regular season. He had a nice pickup on Heath Miller, but he also drafted his defense and his kicker, Wes Welker, Lamar Miller, all guys that contributed throughout the season and helped Carl get to that 9-4 regular season record, that second place finish I was talking about. This is a guy who, again, didn't know as much going into the fantasy draft, didn't think he'd be pulling the trigger on some right picks, definitely had some question mark picks, if you can remember from the 2013 draft, some picks that made you go. But let me tell you, folks, Carl Krause converted on his draft picks. He knows what he's doing. This guy's a football guy. He's a KC guy. If there's 2 things KC people know, it's football, it's barbecue. He knows both. Carl Krause, Over the Dwayne Bowe, hoping he changes his name this year. Third place finish, could vault him into that first place finish with a very quality name. That's right, I'm talking about Carl Krause. I'm going to show you the K ball. Luckily, his middle name does not start with a K as well. It'll be awkward for fantasy football sakes. His players could get on him a little bit. Anyways, moving on to the fourth place team, a team that, as his name would say, was trading no one. Well, he actually did make a few trades throughout the year. If you're looking back on my draft results packet, this is a guy that wasn't afraid to pull the trigger. He only had 2 guys left in his team that he originally drafted, so you know he was making moves. I'm talking about Cameron Herman. I'm talking about the fourth place team, a guy that made 5 trades, 52 waiver wire pickups. He's kind of right there in the middle pack. Surprisingly, only 52 is in the middle of the waiver wire pack, but again, a Wild West league. If you look at the 2 guys he kept on his roster, Ray Rice, somewhat of a disappointing season. Drafted him early, definitely not the first-round draft pick he was hoping for. He's hoping to convert this year. My sources confirm that he's hoping to have a much better draft this year. Maybe grab Ray Rice in the 3rd, 4th round, where he's being projected. The guy's got he's got raw athletic ability, something you like to see, something you got to be a fan of as an owner, or as a fantasy owner. Cameron Herman learned a lot through the season. A guy that was checking his stuff constantly. He knew what he was doing. But the biggest steal of the draft, and probably the reason Cameron was in this 4th place opportunity, a guy who only finished 7-6 in the regular season, sneaks in the playoffs. Of course, if we all remember the dramatic playoff episodes, the last couple weeks of the season, lots of teams in play, even the guy who ended up finishing last place among the current league members was still in the playoff run. Cameron Herman ends up grabbing that 4th spot, ends up getting in the playoffs, did get 4th, obviously wasn't happy about it, but the player I'm referring to is Josh Gordon. He grabs Josh Gordon in the 11th round, a guy who was suspended for the first couple games of the year, ends up being the best receiver in the league despite, average at best quarterback play, Jason Campbell, Brian Hoyer, and of course Brandon Weeden, the disaster out of Oklahoma State, all playing quarterback at some point for the Browns. I'm sure some other guy might have even snuck in there. I think a water boy and or a towel boy was the backup for a couple games this year. But here's a guy who did make a lot of moves and a lot of effective moves. He has the Chiefs defense, obviously a guy that values sacks. He knows those sacks add up. He knows those points add up. He grabbed Riley Cooper, a white wide receiver, a risk, absolutely, but he paid off. Cooper becomes a top 25 receiver, something that was not projected by any analyst, including myself at the start of the year. Tom Brady, the old steady veteran, not quite the fantasy quarterback, used to be only top 15 and not top 5 or top 10, as he's been in his early 30s, late 20s. But let me tell you right now, if you're looking for a quarterback to succeed, you got to like, and winning in that regard, you got to like having Tom Brady on your squad. Absolutely. I'm turning up the brightness on my computer. That's what I was doing. Again, DeMarco Murray, a risky guy to have in your fantasy team. Injuries, always a concern with him. Dallas, not afraid to sling the ball to Tony Romo. Not afraid to allow Tony Romo to throw a lot of interceptions. That's looking at his team last year. Probably one of his best pickups was Stephen Hauschka. I know he personally beat Brett Kohler a couple times because of Stephen Hauschka's big leg, a guy that can put up 20 points a game. So, enough. Cameron Herman's team. Somebody you got to be surprised. A guy who values good running back play. You think you'll go running back early. You think you'll go running back often. Cameron Herman. Now we're moving on to the 5th place team, a team that was 6-7 during the regular season, really had a miraculous playoff run, some good timing with some players having some good games, and I'm talking about Chuck Swanson. Yes, the best Snapchatter in the country, a guy that really just capitalizes on his social media presence as an owner. You got to think that's going to help him attract better players, best players in the fantasy league. That's right, I'm talking about Chuck Swanson, a guy who had Peyton Manning last year, got him in the 2nd round, probably one of the bargains of the league last year. A guy that single-handedly won Chuck 3 out of his 6 games from checking last year's scores. I'm talking about 50-point games. I'm talking about 40-point games. I'm talking about 35-point games. Those are the kind of games that are going to win you fantasy matchups. And that's the kind of player Peyton Manning is, and that's the kind of player Chuck got in the 2nd round. You don't see that often in the 2nd round. That's usually you're going with your 1st round, your Calvin Johnsons, your Adrian Petersons, your Jamal Charles, your LaShawn McCoys, the game breakers, as I like to call them. Well, actually copyright that here. Todd Kiper Berman Jr.'s game breakers, those 4, starting with them. But Peyton Manning should be included. He is at least in the 2nd tier of game breakers. This guy is an absolute stud. He got Michael Crabtree coming off a late season Achilles injury, made a big impact for the 49ers, really helped Colin Kaepernick improve as a receiver. Michael Crabtree, contract here. You know Chuck's got to be hoping to grab him around 4 or 5. Is he going to make it? I see him going round 3. The value in receivers is going up as it's a passing league. Martellus Bennett, his tight end, not great. He has Decker on the team from last year. You know he won't be drafting him. The New York Jets quarterback situation is absolutely abysmal. Decker's going to go low. Chuck might grab him as a bargain. But again, Chuck had a very weak running back core. Shane Vereen, Bobby Rainey, and on the bench, McFadden, Matthews, Sproles. Sproles tailed off during the end of the year. He had a good couple middle weeks of the season, but overall, not as good as you would expect it as a top kind of guy. McFadden, as I've stated multiple times, is a bigger tease than a strip club. Anyways, moving on, Chuck's team, a team that you don't know exactly where he's going to go in the draft, a real mystery man, if you would say it. But let me tell you right now, Chuck Swanson has a chance to surprise some people. Either way, we got to watch out for him this year. One of the youngest members of the league, got to like that. You know he's going to be attracting players. So let's get right to it, everybody. Chuck Swanson. Now we're moving on to the commissioner's team. And that's right, I'm talking about the 6th place team. You're talking about a guy that put in a lot of effort into the fantasy league, not happy with the results he ended up getting. This is a guy who at the end of the season only had one player left from his original draft, and that was Matt Ryan, and he had him on the bench. He was starting Jay Cutler, the gambler, as I like to call him. A guy that made a lot of moves, the David Wilson trade. You know it haunted him for the entire year. Losing Frank Gore, a guy who was consistently putting up 10 to 15 points a week, hurts. You need those points to win a fantasy championship. Although, on paper, this team sounded a lot better than it ended up performing. Let's listen to Jay Cutler, Andre Brown, a risk. Now at Houston, could be better with Foster and those hamstring issues that he always seems to be getting. But again, this is last year. Now we have Edwin Baker. That's probably his worst start of the week. Cleveland. Keenan Allen, Pierre Garçon, Vernon Davis, Larry Fitz, Cardinals D, Alex Henry. Again, a guy that likes defense, a guy that likes receiving. Had a very stacked receiving core last year. Very good evaluator. A guy that plays fantasy football, not flag football quarterback, so he knows the routes that the type of players need to be running to get open. And you got to be excited about that. You know he's going to be drafting well in the quarterback positions. You know he's going to be drafting well in the wide receiver positions. You got to be a little skeptical. He did have an Adrian Peterson on the bench, but due to injuries, he was pulled from that last game. Unfortunately, it hurt him in the matchup against Chuck to try to grab that 5th place. Again, though, he has Edwin Baker on this roster, and then he has a blank roster spot in the last game of the year. And now when you're playing for 5th place, you're going to think he's going to at least try to add someone, try to make a move so he doesn't have to start a guy named Edwin Baker, a guy who sounds like he should be playing in the European Football League, which of course no longer exists, but he sounds like he would be on an English football team, drinking some tea, having himself a good time. But again, he leaves that roster spot open. You got to wonder if his roster, which sounded much better on paper and then didn't perform as well, really affected him as an owner. As a commissioner, I think it wore him down. A couple gray hairs might even popped up. But let me tell you right now, fantasy football, this guy knows it. He loves it. You got to think he's going to be at least in the top 5, top 6. You got to think he's being in contention for a playoff spot. That's right. I'm talking about Daniel Ingram. That's DI, which also stands for dysentery infection, which his team seemed like it got a couple weeks last year. Again, DI, Daniel Ingram. Now we're moving on to the 7th place team that we have left in the league. Of course, we had 12 teams, 2 disbanded owners. We're going to actually take this time to welcome the 2 new owners, which I will discuss in detail later. Jordan Mallon, Evan Green, let's give a brief shout out to them. Woo! Anyways, moving on to the team, the Todd Chadwicks. I'm talking about owner Max Golterman. I'm talking about a guy that managed a fantasy football team while being overseas. Now, people, that may not sound easy. And it's not. It's absolutely not. The foreign time zone thing, he had to be throwing him up. He was waking up at 6. We were going to bed at midnight. I'm not sure exactly the time difference, but it had to play a factor. But here's a guy, again, who drafted well. He drafted Des Bryant. He drafted Aaron Rodgers, Gronkowski, Steve Smith, and Emmanuel Sanders, who's now with Denver. You got to think he's going to be having a bigger year. You know Max is going to be looking for him in that round 8 to 9 range, depending on where he ends up in this lottery. You got to watch out for Max and Emmanuel Sanders. You know that's going to convert. You know it's going to be big. Now, you have to look back. Here's a guy who drafted Rodgers' first-round pick. You got to be confident that pick. A guy who, like Peyton Manning, is a game changer. You got to put him in that top tier with the top running backs. An absolute game changer. The injury in the middle of the season really hurt him. Those are the crucial fantasy weeks. Those are the times when when teams really set their position in the standings. Rodgers goes down. He had some quarterback issues. Nick Foles didn't really put up big fantasy stats till about week 10. So his weeks about 6 to 10. Goldsman struggled. That ultimately hurt him in his chase for a playoff spot. But the Todd Chadwicks, you got to think as he's being back, not from being abroad. He's back in the States. He's on his home turf. He's going to be more comfortable wherever he's staying. He's going to be happy. He's going to be constantly checking his fantasy team. A guy that is going to put in the effort because he likes winning. This guy's an absolute winner. He's going to draft well. Again, you got to look at his team last year. The running back's a little bit weak. We got Joyke Bell and Trent Richardson. Both ended up being backups by the end of the season. He's going to be trying to draft some starters early. You got to think he's been doing his research on the running backs for this year. Look for Goltman to go running back early. So without further ado, MG. Luckily, his middle name doesn't start with an M, because Meek Mill would probably be suing. MMG. Next, we're going to a team with an owner who believes he's to be black, and that's right. I'm talking about Dylan Crane, a team named Black Pride this year. I believe he has another racially, anyways, you're white, man. Anyways, moving on, we're talking about Dylan Crane, who did not draft well. We're talking about he only had 3 guys left from his draft on his team. He did make a lot of moves to get himself out of that last place, but the 3 guys left, he had his 49ers defense, Phil Dawson as the kicker, and Roy Halou as the running back. And that's not a good draft. Only 2 of those guys starting. If you only have a defensive kicker from your draft starting, you know you're not going to be having a great year. Although he did end up with some good players. Andrew Luck, one of my favorite fantasy quarterbacks as an analyst. That's right, it's Todd Kiper Berman Jr. Andrew Luck is one of my favorite quarterbacks for this year. A guy that can run, a guy that can pass, a guy that's carried a very mediocre, in my opinion, Indianapolis team to a 20-10 record over the past couple years. C.J. Spiller, a bust. Vincent Jackson, you think he's going to be connecting with Josh McCown this year, on the roster this year. Got to be thinking Crane's going to be looking for him. A guy that actually did have some pretty decent receivers. He had C.J., well, that's a running back. We actually had Jordy Nelson and Santonio Holmes. Both guys that are okay. Santonio Holmes definitely saw his peak of his career in Pittsburgh. Overall, you got to look at Crane's team, and just a lack of depth really hurt him. Some of his moves didn't pay off, but a guy that was constantly moving and constantly trying to get better. And as a fantasy member of that league, you got to like him being a part of your league because you know he's going to keep things competitive. This guy also wants to win, much like a Max Goldman type, a very good owner, a very competitive owner. And you got to think, he's not dumb enough to draft a Matt Barkley late in the draft, much like Nathan Sprunk did. I don't know if I touched on this earlier, but Nathan Sprunk probably made the biggest bonehead move of the draft by drafting Matt Barkley, a guy who certainly thought he was better than he was coming out of USC, ended up being a 4th-round pick for the Eagles, looking like a career backup, not like McNabb was for the Eagles. But let me tell you right now, not the best pick. Crane doesn't make those picks, although he did draft Aaron Hernandez. We got to think that was a joke. Hopefully he doesn't draft him again this year, doesn't pull the trigger. Hopefully he's not even in the fantasy databases this year. Again, Dylan Crane, everybody, a team to watch out for. Dylan Crane. We're now moving on to a team that was properly titled I Traded Jimmy Graham. That's right, Tom Hummel's team. A team that you got to look at that Jimmy Graham trade, and you got to look at it as the turning point of his season. Did it really help him? Did it make him better? We're not sure. Honestly, I couldn't find the stats, the barometrics. That has to do with temperature, but I still couldn't find it about how the temperature played off of that Jimmy Graham trade. He still ended up with Jason Witten, who's a solid top 5 tight end, but in no way produced the numbers that Jimmy Graham did, or Ron Gronkowski when healthy. Again, you look at this team, a bunch of older guys, a mix of younger and older guys, went with a lot of Packers. His hometown team put a lot of pressure on his hometown team. I think that got to him in the playoffs against the 49ers, even though fantasy isn't playing in the playoffs. You know the pressure was wearing on him all season. Does he go with as many Packers this year? Again, a guy who drafted okay. The guys on his team that he ended up holding on to that he drafted were mostly bench players. You got to look at Hakeem Nicks, Steve Johnson, both somewhat disappointments. In particular, Hakeem Nicks, a guy that scored 0 touchdowns for the Giants last year, who of course struggled, ended with a 6-10 record. Tom Hummel also ended up with a very similar record. I see the coincidences here. I don't see him drafting Hakeem Nicks this year. That's definitely not going to happen. That's not what he does. But a guy who did get Eddie Lacy late in the season, a nice pickup. That's not going to be able to happen this year. Lacy probably going to be a top 10, top 15 pick. Wouldn't be surprised if Hummel sneaks in the top 5. He grabs him with that top 5 pick. A guy that's not afraid to be bold. A guy that's not afraid to just absolutely upset owners, surprise people, shock people. That's what he does. He's an absolute shocker of an owner. You don't know what he's going to do. A complete wild card. A guy that's not happy, again, finishing at the bottom of the standings. A team that surprisingly actually got better despite some of his moves. Michael Floyd, a real late emerger for the Cardinals, really seemed to have a good chemistry with Carson Palmer. You got to think with Bruce Arians at the helm for another season. Michael Floyd, you got to think Hummel's going to be grabbing him later in the year. So without further ado, Tom Hummel. Moving on to the team that was last place in our league, not including the 2 owners that we banished earlier. I guess banished, that's a tough word. I'd like to apologize for that. A team that, again, looked better on paper but did not quite capitalize. A guy who, despite having a positive point differential throughout the entire season, ends up with a 5-7-1 record. A guy that just could not get a break with the schedule. I'm talking about the owner, Brett Kohler. Looking through his roster, the biggest gaping hole you see is at quarterback. The guy that only has Alex Smith and Joe Flacco on his quarterback, rated by ESPN as being Tier 3 guys. Not good players, not guys you want starting on your fantasy team. If you think about it, we have the 15th and the 19th ranked quarterback on his team. It's a 12-team league. You got to think he was be able to get a top 12 quarterback. An absolute idiot for a guy that used to play in high school, wasn't very good in high school, granted, but a guy who should know the position better, who should draft it better. You have to be disappointed there. You have to look at that as the big mistake as to why his team did not succeed last year. Now, across the board, though, he did have very good running backs. He did have very good receivers. You got to look. He had Giovanni Bernard, who's a late bloomer, a guy who's going to go in probably the top 3 rounds. Wouldn't be surprised if he sneaks in around 2, early round 2 for that regard. Frank Gore, an aging veteran, but a guy, again, who I mentioned in the Daniel Ingram segment, who's going to get you 10 to 15 points a game, a steady player, a guy that ends up being on a lot of championship fantasy teams. From my research, he was on 45% of championship fantasy teams. That number just doesn't happen, folks. It's not just a coincidence. Let me tell you right now, Frank Gore's the guy who won your team. Alshon Jeffrey, again, a late bloomer, really came onto the scene in Mark Trestman's offense. Middle of the season, Josh McCown gets replaced. Jay Cutler kept the momentum going. You know he was happy with that pickup. Whoever released him is definitely shaking their head at that mistake. But again, Brett Kohler's team performed like idiots. The owner was an idiot, wasn't quite active enough. Maybe he was over too active. We couldn't quite tell. Was right in the middle of the trades, right in the middle of the free agency wire. Not a late night guy, though, so oftentimes the players he wanted on the free agency wire were not picked up due to his just absolute demand to sleep at about 1:30 a.m. He didn't stay out much later than that. Ended up hurting him the season. That's why he finishes 10th out of the 10 remaining owners. He's very grateful that he wasn't kicked out of the league, considering the last two. He's hoping to make an improvement this year, but overall, not a great performance for the guy. A guy that had the time with a leg injury to watch a lot of fantasy football and do a lot of research. Obviously didn't pay off. You hope his brain is ticking this year. You hope it's working better. So without further ado, Brett Kohler. All right, so now we're getting to our two new owners, and that's right. I'm talking about Jordan Mallon. I'm talking about Evan Green. Two new guys. Mallon will be one of the more older, one of the more seasoned owners in the league, but a guy that knows football, a diehard Bears fan, learned a lot from the Ditka days. Been hearing he's been watching the 85 Bears just to get some tips on how football is properly played, and therefore he's using that formula that he's established. I believe it's a mathematic formula to ultimately have the best fantasy draft ever. He has actually been heard and on record, I believe, with my sources at TBS, I'm confirming, actually take that back, WGN, a Chicago-based station, are confirming this guy is guaranteed to have one of the best fantasy drafts in years, depending on where his lottery slot gets up. He wants a pick in the top 10. He said if he gets a pick in the top 10, he will have the best fantasy draft. He can guarantee it. That's the kind of confidence Mallon brings, that kind of brute force of ownership. A guy that's going to go out and get the players he wants, a guy that's going to make this league better. So without further ado, Jordan Mallon. And finally, Evan Green, another older veteran, another owner, a guy that absolutely loves sports, considered more of a baseball guy at this point, but you know he's going to be doing his research on football, a journalism major, lots of access to a big library and computers and books with paper in them. Although they're not necessarily related to fantasy football, the guy can read, and therefore will be able to read Matthew Berry's fantasy takes and fantasy hints for the week, as well as listen and learn from Todd Kiper Berman Jr. That's right, I consider myself quite the fantasy. Anyways, Evan Green, an owner who you know is going to do his research, you know he's going to play smart, not going to make any dumb trades, could pull off an absolutely crazy trade, an absolute shocker to this league. So without further ado, I know we're all waiting for the lottery. I know you're sitting on the edge of the seat, so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to show you Evan Green's EG. It's time, folks. It's that time of year. It's the lottery. I'm going to shift my computer over. Camera crew, please stay with me. Thank you, guys. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. The lottery. I'm going to grab something to drink. My throat's a little tired. I've been talking for about a half hour straight. Give me 1 second here. The lottery, lots of suspense. If I didn't drink this, I was going to die of thirst, but I'm back. My legs are a little wobbly due to the excessive amount of air that has been going away from my brain and to the rest of my body, to my mouth, to be talking. I'm a little tired, but here we go. The draft lottery, the moment you've all been waiting for. So folks, let me get this ready. I have my pen, my paper, I have suspense, I have you all on the edge of your seat. Without further ado, shut the door. And just give it a couple spins to make sure it's working here. Alright, folks. Here we go. With the first pick of the 2014 SVE and/or Wild West League, the first pick will go to everybody, the league commissioner, Daniel Ingram, a guy who ended up with Adrian Peterson on his roster last year, with Sean McCoy, Adrian Peterson, both guys you could see go at the top of the board. That's right, folks. Daniel Ingram, first pick of the draft. Congratulations to him. Let me write this down real quick so I can do a mock draft later in the segment. With the second pick in the 2014 SBE Fantasy Draft. The pick will go to... I have the second and third picks coming out here, folks. There will be no more spinning for the third pick. 2 balls did come out. The first one to come out was Mike Rowan. That's right, with pick number 2, Mike Rowan, a guy who's had a couple top picks now in leagues, so you got to watch out for him in mocks. If you see him in your board, read his strategy. Again, Mike Rowan, second pick. Congratulations to Mike. With the third pick, we have Dylan Crane. Congrats to Dylan, third pick, a perfect position for him. A guy that likes quarterback play, a guy that likes running back play, but also he likes receiver play more. Look for him to maybe surprise with the third pick. So again, recap, Rowan, second pick, Dylan Crane, third pick. Let me write this down. With the fourth pick, or the fourth pick, will go to a ball that just flew out. Give me a second here, folks. It went under my dresser. This is absolute craziness. Oh. The suspense is killing me. Guys, this is an owner who needs the pick, an owner who finished last place in the league of all the active owners. That's right, it's Brett Kohler with the fourth pick. Congratulations, Brett. Boom, 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 boom. All right, so with the fifth pick in the SB draft, we'll go to the best Snapchatter in the league, possibly in the world. That's right, Chuck Swanson, 5th pick overall. There you go. Congratulations, Chuck.
Yeah.
7 more to go. I know some people on the edge of their seats. People are pining for draft position. Here we go again. 6th pick. And here we go with the 6th pick overall. Very excited to announce that Carl Kraus over the Dwayne Bowe, again, hopefully improves the name this year, is going to be having the 6th pick, a pick right in the middle of the draft, a pick that you know he's going to like. So again, that's Carl Kraus with the 6th overall pick. Yes. With the 7th pick will be made by... Oh, a ball flew out and then a ball came out here. Again, the ball that flew out came out first. I will say that right now. And the 8th pick will remain as it does. I'm sorry for the bingo ball machine. It's not very expensive. It's not the greatest. But again, this is when our first new owner comes into play. That's right. I'm talking about Jordan Mallon. Comes out with the 7th pick overall. Congratulations, Jordan. And to move quickly on to the 8th pick, that will be made by CH. That's right, Cameron Herman. Probably one of the most dedicated fantasy owners in the league. So again, Mallon and then Herman, 7 and 8. So with the 9th pick in the draft, it will be made by the guy who finished with the best regular season record last year. That's right, Nathan Sprunk, a guy that you didn't think wanted to be in the bottom 3 of the draft, but that's what you get when you win a regular season championship. You usually end up in the bottom of that first round. Nate Sprunk with, I believe, the 9th overall pick. Congratulations, Nate. Writing this down real quick again for my mock draft analysis, which will be following directly after this. The 10th pick will be made by Max Goldman and Todd Chadwick's. Again, a guy who's back on American soil. Will probably have a big fantasy year. Congratulations, Max, on the 10th overall pick. There's 2 people remaining. You know they're on the edge of their seats. With the 11th overall pick, we have Tom Hummel. That's right, T.H. Tom Hummel, a guy who was at the bottom of the league last year, but again had a top pick last year, so maybe having those back-to-back picks will be good for him. I've heard he likes it from a source. So here we go, Tom Hummel, 11th pick. So that means, unfortunately, one of our new owners, that's right, Evan Green, will be having the 12th pick overall. Evan Green, congratulations, 12th pick, back-to-back picks, a big chance to capitalize on a couple players, Jimmy Graham, Aaron Rodgers, right in the top 100. Actually, before I get too much into detail, that's the lottery, folks. I hope you enjoyed. So now on to the mock draft. Well, so back to the mock draft. We got to be thinking out here. We got to be looking at the top 100. You got to be looking Daniel Ingram, first pick, a guy who was an Eagles fan, a guy who had both Jamal Charles and Adrian Peterson on his team last year at some point. So you're not sure exactly where he's going to go with this pick. You're not sure what he's going to do. You're just absolutely baffled, and you're not sure. I wanted the NFL music back on. Drake was getting a little old. Anyways, so with the first pick overall, I'm going to go off the board here. I'm going to go a little surprise. As an Eagles fan, as a fan of the Chip Kelly offense, I'm going Daniel Ingram, drafting LaShawn McCoy with the first overall pick in my mock draft. LaShawn McCoy, Shady McCoy, and or Shaky McCoy, as I'm going to call him, has the jukes. He has the moves. He's getting out on a lot of open space in Chip Kelly's offense, which fits perfectly with LaShawn McCoy's playing style. Injury could be a concern, but it, of course, is a concern with all the top running backs. So with the first overall pick, I'm projecting Daniel Ingram drafts LaShawn McCoy. With the second pick, we move on to Rowan. Again, the guy who set the tone for the league this year. I think he sets the tone again for the league this year with the second pick. That's right. He goes with a top player left on the board. I'm talking about Adrian Peterson. Although a Bears fan, he drafts another guy in the NFC Central because he knows the presence Adrian Peterson brings to a fantasy team. He's big, he's tough, he's a bruiser, he fits Rowan's management style, as he also has speed, makes a lot of moves, a lot of cuts. That's what Rowan does, makes a lot of trades, a lot of cuts, a lot of acquisitions. Adrian Peterson looking to have a bounce-back year, potentially playing with Teddy Bridgewater behind center for the Purple People Eaters Skull Vikes. Adrian Peterson goes second to Mike Rowan. With the third pick, Dylan Crane, a guy who, again, is a curveball. Said he could be drafting a receiver, but he did get a little early. You think it's a little early for him to be drafting a receiver with the depth at the position and it being a passing league. You got to be thinking you're going to be able to grab a surprise guy late. So I think he sticks with the board. I think although he, again, is a Rams fan, a guy choosing against a rival, much like Rowan and the Vikings and the Bears and all that mumbo-jumbo, I'm going Dylan Crane, third overall pick. I'm going him with Jamal Charles. That's right, folks. Jamal Charles, a guy that absolutely exploded on the scene last year with Alex Smith behind center, a guy who turned in from a game manager to a game winner in Kansas City. Jamal Charles, big part of that. The screen game really played a factor. Receiving yards are huge. He gets those rushing yards. A very decent, even though the loss of Brandon Albert could hurt the Chiefs line, a decent offensive line. You got to look for him to have a similar type of year. Again, injuries concern, but with the third overall pick, you got to be happy. Landing yourself Jamal Charles, Dylan Crane. Fourth overall pick, we got Brett Kohler, a guy who really doesn't know where he's going to go. He's not going to be drafted in the race. He was rated as a top 5 player. Forte, again, an NFC Central guy. Rumors are he is a Vikings fan. Marshawn Lynch is also the top. Those are the top 3 running backs left on the board. I think Kohler likes Marshawn Lynch. He likes the production, but I think he goes a little surprise here. And I think with his lack of quarterback play last year, I think he goes Peyton Manning. That's right, the 7th overall rated player in Matthew Berry's top 200, and Todd Kiper Berman was a contributor on the top 200. I think he goes Peyton Manning. He loves the quarterback play. He wants to see more consistent play from that position, so that's why I got him going Peyton Manning, 4th overall. Moving on, Chuck Swanson, 5th overall pick, a guy that likes to go chalk with his drafts, a Bear fan, very simple. Matthew Forte is sitting on the board there at number 5, the 4th overall rated player. You got to like that value, a guy that really fit into Mark Trestman's system well. The Chicago offensive line has been significantly upgraded over the offseason, so you got to look for Forte to have another big year, potentially a top 2 fantasy year if things fall his way, if Cutler stays from being turnover prone. So I'm thinking Chuck goes Matt Forte with the 5th overall pick. Moving on to the 6th overall pick, we have Carl Kraus, a guy who probably hopes Jamal Charles has a somehow miraculous fall of the number 6 spot, a big KC guy. But again, you got to look at Carl, a guy that drafted very well last year, didn't get too risky with any of his picks, and that's why I think he goes with Marshawn Lynch. Although he is rated behind Eddie Lacy in the top 200, I think Marshawn Lynch is a very consistent player. Carl likes to flash. He likes Skittles. They both get along very well. If they were to ever meet, I think Carl and Marshawn Lynch, a match made in heaven. That's why I got Carl going with Marshawn Lynch at the 6th overall pick. Will fit his team well. A guy that likes to build his team from the running back position out. Carl Kraus, Marshawn Lynch, 6th overall pick. Now moving on to the 7th overall pick, we're looking at Jordan Mallon, a guy that is new to the league. So we're not exactly sure how he's going to be working as an owner, what he's going to be doing. He's got Eddie Lacy sitting there on the board. Is he too big of a Bears fan to draft a Packers player? I say yes. But he's not too big of a fan of the Detroit Lions. He's a big fan of Megatron, though, and that's why I think, as a new owner, a guy that wants to make a splash in the league, I think he goes with a guy whose colors are blue and silver, the colors of water. If you want to get right down to it, I think he drafts Calvin Johnson. That's right, folks. Calvin Johnson going to Jordan Mallon with the 7th overall pick. With the 7th overall pick, I believe. Yes, the 7th overall pick. I'm terrible at math. I went to English school. I apologize for mathematics not being great. But I still got Jordan Mallon drafting Calvin Johnson with the 7th overall pick. Now moving on to the 8th overall pick, we're looking at Cameron Herman. He's got Eddie Lacy sitting on the board. Kind of Ray Rice build type of player, a little bit taller, a little bit stockier. He likes the SEC. He likes football. I think this is a point where Eddie Lacy comes off the board. Cameron Herman didn't draft well last year. That hurt him in the early weeks of the season, although he did sneak into the playoffs. You got to think he's been looking for players that have the big boom-bust potential. That's the way Cameron lives his life. It's boom or bust. The guy goes crazy. The guy goes all out. And I think Eddie Lacy, with the play of Aaron Rodgers behind center, definitely be taking some defenses back, definitely be helping that new and improved Packers line. Eddie Lacy goes to Cameron Herman with the 8th overall pick. So we're now moving on to the 9th overall pick, and that means Nathan Sprunk is drafting. Again, a guy who knows the value of a good tight end. He has Julius Thomas on his team last year. Julius Thomas, a guy that won him some games. He knows wide receiver position is deep. Peyton Manning's off the board, so you know that threat's not even there. You got to think, again, this guy loves the tight end position, built like a tight end. I think he goes Jimmy Graham, a guy who recently lost his arbitration case. Would have called him a wide receiver if he had won it, but he is a tight end, folks. Jimmy Graham going to Sprunk. Going to win him a couple games this year. You know, you got to be thinking the running back depth in the league isn't that great, but again, a passing league. Sprunk knows this. He knows the chemistry between Breeze and Graham. He likes the Saints a little bit. That's why he goes Jimmy Graham, 9th overall pick. Moving on to the 10th overall pick. I discussed it in length. Max Goldman, a guy who managed a team from across seas, folks, not as easy as it sounds. He's got some very intriguing players up on the board. Arian Foster, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, the guys left in the top 12, the guys that are given that first-round grade. Does Goldman go with that? I'm not 100% sure. I think he sees Foster as an injury-prone player, a guy who has faulty hamstrings. Goldman does not like players with faulty hamstrings. That much is known. So I think he goes again. I think he takes the risk. I think he takes the so-called leap. I think he goes with Aaron Rodgers to the devastation of Tom Hummel, a Packers fan. I think he goes Rodgers on the board here. He was great for Goldman when he played last year, although the injury did play a big factor in him not making the playoffs. I do think Goldman gives him another chance. I think he grabs Rodgers at the 10 pick, really setting some people at the 11 and 10, sets it up for a very intriguing middle of the draft area here. That's, of course, where the biggest intrigue comes. I would say rounds between 3 and 5. That's when fantasy championships are won. Let me tell you, Goldman goes with Aaron Rodgers with the 10th overall pick. Now moving on to the 11th overall pick, we have Tom Hummel, who, again, I think will be devastated that Rodgers isn't on the board. We got Foster, we got Breeze. Hummel had some injury concerns on his team last year, some things that hurt his team. Again, I think Foster scares him off. I think he goes with a real surprise pick here. I think he goes Monty Ball, the best running back left on the board at number 11. Again, running back depth in the league, not as good as it used to be. You try to think he capitalized on running backs early, gets consistent play, more consistent play. A guy who got a lot of big games out of people last year, but got also a lot of small games out of people last year. Monty Ball, I think, will be a very consistent runner, much like Noshawn Moreno. He's taken over Noshawn Moreno's carries. I think Tom Hummel drafts Monty Ball, goes a little off the board, but he drafts Monty Ball to the 11th overall pick, a pick that I think will be very good for him in the future. Now we go on a 12th pick. Evan Green, again, a guy that will do his research, a guy that knows. He knows he's done the research on Arian Foster. As he's seen Bill O'Brien quote recently on ESPN.com, Foster is going to be a very important piece of the new Texans offense. Bill O'Brien, of course, a coordinator with Tom Brady in New England. A guy knows how to utilize a running back with a little less skill. A guy that's aging. You got to think Corey Dillon. Those kinds of players. Bill O'Brien knows how to work with those guys. I think he'll know how to turn Arian Foster back into a top 10, if not a top 5 running back. And that's why I think Evan Green's going to go with Arian Foster with the 12th overall pick. Let me tell you, not an absolute shocker, and you got to be happy as a 12th overall guy when you get a guy that's rated 10th overall, a new owner in this league, trying to make a splash, trying to make a name for himself, trying to show that he belongs. Arian Foster's a guy that a couple years ago, for the past 4 years, minus this year, was a top 3, top 5 running back. If you get that kind of value at number 12, you're excited. Those are the kind of picks that win leagues. Green knows this. Evan Green knows this. Evan Green and Green, of course, being the same person. An absolute phenomenal pick for him there at 12. I hope you all enjoyed. This is Todd Kiper Berman Jr. Hope you enjoyed the 2014 SPE League Draft Lottery commissioned by Dan Ingram, sponsored by Monster. Hope you all have a great day, and have a good one, fellas.